Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here to make another video to help you improve your chess game. Last year I won the award for Best Video on YouTube with regard to chess instruction, and that video had to do with the different ways to find better chess moves. Or the better way to, I better say that, the 5 ways to make better chess moves. And a lot of people who don't really understand what I'm trying to say make fun of me and say, like, oh, well, there's only one way to do that, and, you're just playing with semantics. But that's not really true. Let me review, 5 of the ways that you can become a better chess player. And, of course, becoming a better chess player and finding better moves and making better moves is very much similar. So the 5 that I was talking about, the first one was to add knowledge, and that's the one most people do. They study openings, they study endgames. And we might even say to improve your knowledge. What's the difference between adding knowledge and improving your knowledge? Well, you can subtract negatives. For instance, suppose your knowledge tells you that double pawns are terrible and you should always avoid them. Well, as you get better and you analyze with good players, you start to realize sometimes it's perfectly okay to get double pawns, and you stop realizing that, double pawns are always bad. So your knowledge improves because you have a better understanding of that, and you just don't think double pawns are bad. Or maybe you think that a rook is always worth exactly a knight plus 2 pawns, and if you don't get 2 pawns and a knight for your rook, then giving up a rook for a knight and a pawn, or a rook for a bishop and a pawn, is a terrible thing that could always lose you the game. Well, sometimes it can, but there's sometimes when it's okay to do stuff like that. And as you learn those kind of things, that improves your knowledge. The second obvious way is to improve your analysis and your evaluation. And we could make those 2 different ways. But your analysis and your evaluation is really more important than your knowledge, in the sense that you're finding moves, better moves in positions where you don't know what to do, or you can't look them up in a book just by studying more openings or more endgames. And that's the majority of positions. You want to analyze better. You want to evaluate better. The third thing would be improve your time management. If you're playing too fast and you finish games with a lot of time on your clock, you learn to slow down. If you play too slow and you get into unnecessary time trouble, you learn that speeding up may allow you to make more errors early in the game, but you have a tremendous number of chances to win a lot of games that you're just giving away at the end of the game. So the net result is much positive when you speed up if you're playing too slow. So improving your time management. The fourth thing would be to improve your consistency. Your consistency would be, you're doing things right for a while, and then all of a sudden you lose concentration, or you have a good thought process, but then you don't follow it. Chess is the kind of game where if you do it right 95% of the time, which is for 38 moves out of 40, that's not very good. It's like not falling down 95% of the time when you're walking around a block. That's not very good. You're going to get pretty sore falling down 5% of the time. Well, if 5% of the time you have a chance of making big errors in a chess game, 5% of 40 moves is 2 moves. So and it only takes 1 bad move to lose a game, so that would be twice as many as you would need to lose the game. And of course, there's other ways that you can improve. You can improve your psychological aspect. The last video I made was about Don't Panic, which basically was an amateur game where at some point in the game, a key thing came up, and my student panicked, and he started to play fast and silly, and his psychology was really bad at that point, and he was thinking out loud for me, so it was pretty easy for me to see that. So improving things like your psychology is also really important. So we've got a whole bunch of ways that you can not just find better moves, but make better moves. And there's a lot of ways, and if you think, let's say for instance you don't think that getting feedback is important. Let's say you just study and play, study and play, study and play, and you never get rid of your misconceptions. You never listen to good players analyze. You never get feedback on what you know and what you don't know, and why did you make that move, and talk to good players about it. Every good player in the world pretty much got there by getting a ton of feedback. And if you have a paradigm of getting better where you don't have that feedback, that can really hurt. So I thought as sort of a fun thing to do today, we could look at Magnus Carlsen's game with Anish Giri. And I did not see this game at all, and what you're about to see is what I'm going to see for the first time. And we can kind of talk about what Magnus is doing and what Anish is doing. Unfortunately, Chess 24, which we have in front of us here, doesn't show us the time stamping as I go through the game, at least not this way. So we're not going to be able to see the too fast, too slow kind of thing. But we do see at the end of the game, it was move 36, and Magnus Carlsen had 41 minutes left, and Anish Giri had 2:20. Is that too slow for Anish? No, not really, because he can make 4 moves in 2 minutes and 20 seconds with an increment pretty easily. Is it too fast for Magnus? Well, maybe he was winning quite easily early in the game and he was able to play fast. I don't know, because I haven't seen the game. I did see the final position and I rewound it. And that's all I know. I know the final clock and I know the final position, but I don't know anything that happened in between. I don't even know whether Magnus started with E4 or D4 or C4 or knight F3. I don't even know the first move of the game. So let's take a quick look at the game and we'll sort of make a video of it and we'll talk about things that you can do to try to improve here too. All right, so D4, and of course when we're in the opening, we're talking a lot of knowledge. So here, of course, if you're black and you're playing against D4, you want to have a tabiya against D4. Maybe you want to be ready to play a Nimzo Indian, or if they play knight F3 on the third move, a Queen's Indian. Maybe you want to play a King's Indian. Maybe you want to play a Slav defense. And of course, the top grandmasters pretty much know all these things, and they know what the other guy usually plays, and they prepare something for them. Most of us don't know who we're going to play. We can't prepare 30 moves against someone based on their database that we get from ChessBase, because our average opponents don't have games in ChessBase. So we just have to come to the board prepared with your tabiyas. Anish played knight f6, which could start out as an Indian defense, maybe transpose, we'll see. So now the normal way for Magnus to play would be to play c4. That's the main move. Now we know Magnus likes to kind of take people out of the book, so we wouldn't be surprised if he plays knight f3 or bishop f4 or even bishop g5, Trumpovsky. He plays c4. Okay, main line. You don't see Magnus do that all the time, but he certainly does it some of the time, and he likes to keep people guessing. Now the main move is e6, going Nimzo Indian, sort of playing g6 and playing King's Indian, a little out of style, playing g6 and playing Grunfeld a little bit more in style, but I don't know if Giri does that, so I'm expecting e6 here. And he does, not surprising. And now I think the computers like knight f3 a little bit better than knight c3. The computers don't like allowing the Nimzo Indian knight c3, bishop b4. Doesn't mean Magnus won't do it. If he feels like, let's play a Nimzo and I'll play a line that I like, he's definitely going to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. And he does play what's now the main move, knight f3. And now there's a big choice for Giri, and I'm sure he knows exactly what he wants to do. Bishop b4 check is a Bogo Indian. b6 is the Queen's Indian. d5 offers the Queen's Gambit. c5 probably not going to be played, offering a Benoni. Those are some of the choices that Anish has. Let's see what he does. He plays d5. Okay, so here white can play knight c3 and give black a large choice of moves, or white could play c takes d5 and see if he wants to head into a Carlsbad formation. He plays g3 and says, would you like to play a Catalan system? All right, and black says, sure. Bishop g2, castle, castle. Now I think d takes c4 is the main line. I can't draw lines like I do in when I'm showing you things on the ICC board. Pawn takes pawn. Okay, white usually plays something like knight e5 here, but it's not the only move. Knight a3. Look at the evaluation drop down. Right now it says Magnus has a normal opening advantage of about 0.3, and after he plays the knight a3 line, the computer drops him all the way down to minus 0.08. So the computer says, yeah, you can do that, it's equal, but, and this is again Magnus kind of avoiding the number one main lines just to say, let's play chess. Black says, oh, I'm going to move the bishop twice and double and isolate your pawns. Usually grandmasters don't do that. They usually don't give up the bishop pair so easily. That's what we're talking about ahead of time, about knowledge. Now, is bishop takes a3 a book move? I'm sure it is, and I'm sure Anish didn't have to think about it. He just said, oh, I want to play the bishop takes a3 line, but if it wasn't a book move, we would think grandmasters don't often quite give up the bishop pair that easily just to mess up the pawn structure. Do they do it sometimes? Of course. Okay, so Magnus takes. Black plays bishop d7. I'm sure for these guys it's all book. I'm a little bit out of my book. But white can still play a move like knight e5. He plays a4, aiming to put his bishop on that a3 square. See, I can't draw those lines every time I do that. It wants to bring up a little window there. All right, so a4. And, you know, I'm guessing this is still book. But they might be getting near the end of their book. I don't know. Bishop c6, bishop a3. Now this is where every beginner is going to play rook e8 immediately and say, I can't give him the exchange. And I believe Anish Giri did play rook e8. But this is what I was saying before about knowledge. There are some positions where if you get him to give back up the bishop pair here, black wouldn't get the bishop pair, and you get that dark square bishop off the board, it's worth something for the rook. Here I don't think it is. Here Giri I think will play rook e8. And he does, no surprise. And white plays queen c2, says, let me get my pawn back there on c4. Black says, you can have it, but if you played queen takes c4, I'll play knight b6 and fork your queen and your a pawn, and then I'll win the a pawn and I'll be up a clear pawn. So Magnus says, you're right, so I will not take that pawn yet, but if you play knight b6, I can play a5 and then take the pawn. Black says, well, if you keep waiting, I'll play a6 and then play b5. Now I'm pretty sure the players are, I'm not positive they're out of their book, but it looks like they're probably out of their book. So they're probably starting to play much slower. And, if you watch grandmasters play a lot, they don't play like amateurs where they bop along real fast till they get into trouble and then they go, uh-oh, and then they take a couple minutes and they don't find the answer and then they lose the game. They try to, as someone told me when I first started out, they try to play slow to avoid getting into trouble. Okay, so here Magnus is going to, again, not play queen takes c4 because of knight b6. He might play a5 so that if black plays b5, he can play a takes b5 en passant, but then black could take back with the pawn and then play b5. So Magnus has to be a little bit careful here. He could play, again, knight e5, but then knight takes knight and the bishops get traded, so probably this is not the ideal time to play knight e5. He could get his last piece in the game and play rook fd1. Rook fd1 would satisfy the principle, move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. Right now, both sides have not 100% followed that because Anish has played bishop d7, bishop c6. He's moved that bishop twice, but that's why Magnus is ahead in development here. He only has one piece out of the game, his rook on f1, while Anish still has to get his rook on a8 and his queen out of the game, but in compensation, he's temporarily got that pawn ahead. So white says, I'll take right now. So now we have to see what's his idea on knight b6. Is he just going to give up that a pawn? And Anish says, show me, Magnus. And Magnus says, okay. And now if Anish wants, he could even take with the knight and hit the queen. And he does. And of course, Magnus is going to have to keep moving the queen. And Magnus is down a pawn. But he has the bishop pair. The bishops are pretty strong. He's going to put the queen somewhere in the middle. And then maybe push pawn to e4 at some point. He can't threaten that right away because black's got two pieces on e4. So he plays queen to b3. And now Stockfish thinks that Magnus is down 0.84 after that move. It really likes black's. It doesn't think Magnus has enough for the pawn, but Magnus is probably not that unhappy. He's got a lot of pieces on the board. He's got more space. He's a little ahead in development. There's a lot of chess to be played. He's got the bishop pair. Computer says, oh, let me play black, and if I play perfectly for the next 60 moves, I bet I can win. And Magnus is like, that doesn't really matter. I'm playing a human. I have a perfectly interesting middle game to play here. So black says, how about trading queens now that I'm up a pawn? And the engine says, that probably wasn't your best idea. Game's back to even. You can see the little thermometer over here, 0, 0, 0 equal. Magnus says, oh, there's that idea we were talking about at the start of the video. I can sacrifice the exchange, a rook for a bishop. That removes the guard on the knight on a4. So black can't just play b takes c6 because if queen takes a4 and white wins two pieces for rook. But what happens if black plays either queen takes c6 or if he plays queen takes b3 trading queens and then he takes the rook? Well, that trading queens doesn't work because queen takes b3, a takes b3, c takes b6, b takes a4 again wins two pieces for a rook and white would just be winning. So the only way that Anish can try to hold on to the knight here is to play queen takes c6. And then white's going to get something like knight to e5 in. So I'm expecting Anish will play queen takes. And this gets back to what we were talking about again at the start of the game. Magnus's knowledge was that rook takes c6 was an idea. Then he had to analyze it. Then he had to evaluate it. And I'm analyzing and evaluating it now. And I'm saying, maybe Anish should try queen takes because the other ways look clearly pretty bad. And he does play queen takes. So that's analysis. Analysis says that. And now my analysis says that white's going to try to remove the guard on that knight, maybe with a move like knight e5. But then black can play queen to b5. But then the b pawn is hanging. And white's going to get some play. Does white have anything better than playing knight e5 here? Well, again, we'd have to analyze. And I don't have all day. It's only about a 25-30 minute video. But knight e5 is kind of the obvious move to try to shake up the queen, but maybe he can do something else to make that knight uncomfortable on a4. Let's see what Magnus does. Knight e5. Okay, so now black pretty much has to play queen to b5. Every other move seems to just lose the knight for nothing. He can't counterattack the queen. The bishop's hitting the queen. So queen b5, then Magnus could play bishop to b7. He could play queen takes b5 followed by bishop takes b7, which I don't think is the right idea. Or he could even just move the queen and threaten to play rook b1. He could play like queen c2 and then rook b1. All right, so let's see what happens. There's that move, queen b5. All right, white has to analyze and evaluate. Analyze and evaluate. Queen c2 followed by rook b1. Looks pretty good. Bishop takes b7 right away. Doesn't look as good. Maybe rook on a to b8. Then white could play bishop c6, but then queen takes b3, a takes b3, and his bishop on c6 is hitting the rook while the pawn is hitting the knight. But I don't know. Then rook takes b3, bishop takes e8, rook takes a3, maybe okay for black. Again, analysis and evaluation. All right, so white does play queen c2, says, no, I'm not ready to trade queens yet. I'm not getting enough for my pieces. But right now, my bishop pair and that awkward knight. So now black has a little trouble. If he plays knight b6 and then rook b1, maybe he has to play something like queen a5 and then knight c4. Pretty dangerous. So I guess he can't play knight c4 because knight's on b6. So he plays knight d5, and look at that evaluation jump. Right, it was 0-0-0 before he played that. Equal, and after knight d5 it says, ooh, if white finds the right move, he's winning. Now, of course, Magnus doesn't see that thermometer like we do on the left side of the board when he's playing, so he doesn't know that that's a big mistake. He has to use his judgment and his analysis and evaluation again to determine, can I take advantage of that? You know, if I now play, rook to b1, is that really good? Do I have something better? Can I play, maybe e4 or... he's got to look at different lines. The first line I would look at is rook b1. The problem with e4 is the knights now have the c3 square. Is it possible to play something like bishop takes d5, and he can't take with the queen because he loses the pawn, the knight on a4. If he takes with the pawn, then maybe queen to f5, hits the f7 pawn, but then black could probably just play rook to e7. No, he can't. The bishop's hitting that square. So bishop takes, pawn takes, queen f5. Maybe black could play f6. And what would white do against f6? I don't think that's the main line, but it's interesting. Bishop takes d5, e takes d5, queen f5, f6. Not convinced. I really still think he's going to play rook to b1. Let's see what he does. Rook to b1. Okay, I'm always glad when the computer makes me look good, or since, as I said, I haven't seen the game, so I'm just guessing along with you. All right, so rook b1, the queen still has to guard the knight. He can't block with the knight, so I think he's going to play queen to a5, but then white could play rook takes b7. And then black could block in the rook by moving one of the knights back. He could play knight on 4 to b6. And the other knight's guarding the c7 square. The queen's now hitting the bishop. All right, so I think black's going to play queen a5 maybe. Yes, he does. All right, what can white do here? Well, he can't, as he said, he can play rook takes b7. What else could he play? He could play bishop takes d5 followed by rook takes b7. He could play bishop takes b5, bishop takes d5 followed by a different move. Let's see what he does. Bishop takes d5. All right, as we said, black can't take with the queen because his knight would hang. Has to take with the pawn. So white has some interesting moves here. He can play queen f5. but then f6. He could play rook takes b7, can't be that bad. Now rook b7, knight b6. He could probably then move the bishop. All right, let's see what happens here. Rook takes b7, c5, and now the thermometer is all the way up near 4. That pawn on f7 is looking really weak. Can white just play queen f5 here? Well, now queen f5, black has rook f8 because the c5 pawn's blocking the line, but white's got all kinds of stuff. He's got knight d7, followed by like bishop takes c5. Can he just play rook takes f7 here? Probably not. This is pattern recognition. This is, if rook takes f7, rook takes e5, removing the guard. Then rook takes g7 check because he's going to lose the rook anyway. King takes, and white's just losing. Rook takes f7, rook takes e5 doesn't look good. Knight takes f7, on the other hand, is definitely a move. So white has knight d7. He's got knight f7. You know, I can't take 10, 15 minutes to analyze, but this is what we call criticality assessment. This is a very critical position. So if Magnus has a lot of time on his clock, we don't expect Magnus to play fast here. You know, he's going to look at all these juicy moves he's got. Knight d7, queen f5, knight takes f7. And he's going to analyze each one carefully, evaluate them, and pick the one he thinks has the best chance. If the first one he looks at wins the game easily, well, then he doesn't really need to compare. But if the first one just gives him a good game, then of course he's going to look, you know, when you see a good move, look for a better one. And here we know we're cheating. The computer says there's something worth 373. Magnus plays queen f5, and Stockfish stays around that level, so that was probably the right move. And now the problem with playing f6 is that white can play a move like queen to d7, and it's like made in a couple moves. You know, for instance, queen f6, queen d7, queen e1 check, king g2, and g7 is just hanging. So black pretty much has to play rook f8 here. I don't see any other moves. F6, and by the way, how did I do f6, queen d7? Was that analysis? Well, my analysis backed it up, but that was really pattern recognition. I recognize once that f-pawn moves, if I can double my queen and my rook on the 7th rank, and he can't put a rook or a queen on the 7th rank, then the game's pretty much over. So that was pattern recognition from studying lots of games and playing over lots of annotated games, backed up by a little bit of analysis. So f6 is no good. He's got to play, pretty much got to play rook f8. Does he have any other moves? Well, he could play queen e1 check first and then play rook f8. But getting his queen out of the defensive area seems pretty bad. Can he play rook takes e5? Of course not. Queen takes f7 followed by queen g7 as mate. So rook f8 got to be the move. Of course, that was forced. All right, now what can white do? Well, white could play knight d7. He can play knight takes f7. He can play rook takes f7. Can he play knight c6, hit the queen, and then play knight e7 check? Then king h8, then queen takes h7 check, then king takes, and then rook h4 mate. No, that's a famous mating pattern. But there's no rook to play h4 mate, so playing knight e7 check followed by queen h7 check followed by rook to the h file with mate is a famous mate, but unfortunately we don't have a rook that can go there, so that's not going to be it. Okay, so what can Magnus do? Well, obviously he can take on f7. He can play knight c6 first. Does he have any other moves? Could he play knight g4? That doesn't look right. Could he bring the bishop into the attack with bishop c1? No, because queen e1 check doesn't make any sense. I don't think he's going to bring the bishop into the attack. I think he's going to do it with the knight and the queen and the rook. Rook takes f7. Does that threaten rook g7 check? It doesn't look like it. Knight f7. Does that threaten knight h6 check? Doesn't look like it. Well, knight h6 check, he can't take with the pawn because queen g4 check and queen g7 is mate. But he can just move the king back and forth. So knight f7, he does something. Knight h6, king h8. Then can white attack g7? Then maybe. All right, so let's see what he did. He does play there. So I think knight h6 is a threat. He can't take with the pawn because queen at g4 followed by queen g7. And if he moves the king, then the queen and the rook will threaten mate, and the knight's guarding the g8 square. And also if he plays rook g8, then knight f7 is smothered mate. So right now, knight h6 check is a winning threat here for white. So Giri says, Your knight's pinned to your queen. I'm going to bring my queen back into the defensive area. If you take my queen, I'll take your queen. And then I'll just be up the exchange. Well, we know Magnus is not going to play knight takes d8. That would be a beginner move. You know, he's gonna look at knight h6 check, and if knight h6 check doesn't work, then he's going to just play something like d takes c5 and just push the c pawn down the board. So knight h6 check is the #1 candidate move, but we gotta calculate it. Knight h6 check, g takes h6, queen g4 check, queen g5, and I think that black is just winning. So maybe knight h6 check here doesn't work. But white is in no hurry here. He could also start with a move like rook d7. He could play d takes c5. Let's see what he does. D takes c5. See how that makes sense. He's got black all tied up, and now he gets a second pawn for the exchange. So if you're going by Reinfeld numbers, where rook is where the bishop and 2 pawns, Magnus now has the bishop and the 2 pawns, but Magnus's pieces are much, much more active. And one of the main things that you do to evaluate positions, the 4 evaluation criteria are king safety, which is probably number 1A, activity, which is normally number 1, material, which is normally number 1, activity, which is the strong third, and a distant fourth, but still important as pawn structure. So here, the material looks even, but actually white's ahead, and white's way ahead in activity, and white's king is much, much, much safer. That knight on f7 is pinned, so you got to watch out a little bit. But now that you're about equal in material, things are looking very good for white. Black says, I realize this endgame may not be that good. You know, you got a dangerous passed pawn. You got 2 pieces for the rook, but it's the best I got, so my king's in trouble. So let's go into the endgame. Now, if Magnus plays queen takes d5, black can play rook takes f7. Then rook takes f7, and if black plays queen takes f7, then queen takes a8 check. So, queen takes d5 is a move. Queen takes d5, he can't take the knight with the king, he can't take with the queen because of rook takes f7. If he takes with the rook, then rook takes. So queen takes d5 looks safe. Maybe black can play knight c3 on queen takes d5. Then white has knight h6 double check, king h8. Now you can't play Fyodor's legacy with queen g8 check, rook takes g8, knight f7 mate, because then queen takes f7 and you just sacrificed your queen, and then he's going to sacrifice his queen for a knight, and that doesn't work. So queen takes d5, knight c6, knight h6 check, double check, king h8, queen g8 check, rook takes g8, knight f7 trying for smother mate, queen takes f7, rook takes f7 doesn't work. So after queen d5, knight c3, white would probably have to play, what could he play? Not quite sure. So maybe he won't play queen d5. Let's see what he does. He just trades queens and says, I got enough now. Black takes, and now that pawn on c6 is becoming a monster, c5 I mean. He plays knight checks, king has to go to h8, it's the only legal move. Now the knight's going to be really pleasantly placed on a square like f5. He pushes the pawn first to c6. Black tries to stop it by blocking it. Now white can push the pawn, and then the bishop can guard it. He can play c7 followed by bishop d6. That's always pleasant. He does play c7. That rook on a8 is kind of weak. The knight forks the pawn on a2 and e2, but the pawn on a2 is not that important right now, even though if the knight wins that pawn, he gets a passed pawn on the a file. So white can play bishop b2, and if knight takes a2, bishop takes f6 is checkmate with a knight and a bishop. So after bishop b2, black would have to play knight takes e2 check, but then after king f1, white's threatening checkmate, and he's threatening the knight, and black can't stop both. So after bishop b2, knight takes a2 is not possible, knight takes e2 is not possible. So black would have to play d4, and then white could play maybe e3, undermining the knight. It's probably not the best thing for white, but it's interesting to look at it. Let's see what Magnus does. He does go there. I think if black plays knight e4, then f3 removes the guard on the f6 pawn. So I think he has to play d4, and he does. Now white could just play king f1 and guard his pawn, or he could play e3. He plays knight f7 check first, heading for d6, trying to win the exchange. King there. I would be very surprised if Magnus does anything but knight to d6. Knight d6 winning the exchange. I think at this point probably Giri's getting into time trouble because, as I said at the start of the video, he only finished with 220 on his clock on 36 moves, and we're already up to move 31. He moves his king. White guards his e-pawn. Black says, please take my rook now so at least I have a chance to win the c-pawn. White says, okay. White says, go ahead and take that pawn with your knight. Black does. White says, I get that pawn. Now White's just up 2 pawns in the endgame. Nobody, even Stockfish, can't give Magnus Carlsen a 2-pawn odds in the endgame. So knight hits the bishop. The bishop comes back. And with 4 moves to go and 220 on his clock, Giri resigns. I think the engine said if he plays rook c4 here to hit the a-pawn, Magnus will just play rook b6, hitting the knight and the a-pawn. And the knight would have to go to c7 to try to guard it. Then he could remove the guard with something like bishop f4. And eventually he's threatening to win the pawn when the knight saves itself. And Black doesn't have time to win the a-pawn. So Magnus is just up a clear, healthy 2 pawns. His bishops are better than knights in endgames where there's pawns on both sides of the board. That's my knowledge speaking again. 2 pawns, 2 healthy pawns, plenty enough to win the game against most people. But when you're playing really, really good players, you don't have to make them prove it. It's kind of hopeless. Okay, so today we talked about all the ways you can make better moves and find better moves. And we talked a little bit in terms of Carlsen's game with Giri. We didn't have the time stamping, but hopefully you got the idea. And the more you go over stuff like this, I think the better player you are. Okay, if you get a chance, tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. If you want to subscribe, great, and you can like the video if you like. Thanks a lot. Bye.